For several years now, scientists have been baffled upon finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Fragments of several types of proteins have been extracted from these dinosaur fossils. Protein degradation studies contradict the claims by evolutionists that certain conditions could preserve proteins in a buried fossil for millions of years. Instead, they reveal direct evidence that these fossils are only a few thousand years old. Coming up on today's edition of Origins, Immortal Proteins with Dr. Kevin Anderson. Hello, and welcome to Origins. I'm Ray Heiple. It's an honor to be your host today. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science, along with other important facts validating the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Dr. Kevin Anderson, received his PhD in microbiology and was a research fellow at the National Institutes of Health. He has served as a university professor, taught graduate-level molecular biology, and was the director of research for a biotech company. He has also written numerous technical publications and is currently the director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center in Arizona. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we are very excited about today's program. I'm especially intrigued by the title, Immortal Proteins. Now, that doesn't seem possible to me.
It shouldn't be possible, but yet that's almost what's being suggested in order to explain the idea that dinosaur fossils found all around the world still contain pieces of proteins. This will include collagen, which is a very dominant bone protein, but also actin and myosin and histones and tubulin and tropomyosin and hemoglobin. See, the list goes on of different pieces of proteins that are still found in these dinosaur fossils. Now, how old are dinosaur fossils usually supposed to be?
Well, they're supposed to be 68 million or more years old.
Or more, yeah, at least 68 million. Some of these proteins have been found in fossils that are 85, 100, 195 million years old by the assigned dates they're given. So apparently somebody seems to think that proteins are virtually immortal.
So these proteins are cells, biological cells.
Well, proteins are a biological molecule along with other molecules that are used to make cells.
So sort of the building blocks of cells.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And like any biological molecule, they're subject to degradation. They're going to degrade faster or slower depending on the conditions, but all studies that have been done would tell us that collagen will totally degrade in less than 4 million years, even in ideal conditions. And it's fairly tough. It's fairly resistant to degradation, but even then, less than 4 million years under ideal conditions is not the same as 70 million years in far from ideal conditions, buried in a bone, buried in the ground. And in fact, not just collagen, but other proteins. I mentioned the actin and the myosin. What we know about these proteins, they're even more fragile than collagen. So they would last even just a fraction of the less than 4 million years. Theirs would be less than 1 million years, less, maybe even 100,000 years.
And again, we're talking ideal. There's no way we could naturally get it better.
Yes, yes. So these give you upper limits, no more than.
Yeah.
And yet, if we're going to find collagen and actin and myosin in fossils claimed to be 70 million years old, how's that happen? You see, that's now a problem for the evolutionist community, for those claiming that these fossils are that old. Okay? Problems with collagen survival is, see, it's at its most stable when it's also at its most temperature sensitive. So we have a conundrum of conditions going on. It's most stable, but now any fluctuation in temperature will have more effect on it. So that's not suited for extreme preservation. And By evolutionary geology. See, they're going to place the Hell Creek Formation, which is part of the Cretaceous, they're going to place it at a time when the world was viewed, or at least that area was viewed, as going to be a megathermal environment. In other words, it was going to be much warmer than it is today. Well, now, remember, collagen is most stable when it's its most temperature sensitive. You're saying that it was buried during a time where temperatures were warmer even than today. And so a paper in 2008 calculated, said, based on this, the collagen half-life of bones buried during this time in the Hell Creek Formation would be 2,000 years. So half-life, 2,000 years, that means in 2,000 years you've lost half your protein. 4,000 years, you've lost 75% of your protein. You're not going to get...
It doesn't take very long.
You're not going to get 65, 70 million years worth of preservation at that rate. And this 2008 paper in Science is very critical of the claim that there was proteins in these dinosaur fossils, because no, it can't be. It's just impossible.
So even though the scientists are saying, some scientists are saying, we found these proteins, these other ones are saying, no, you didn't.
Yes, exactly.
You couldn't have.
And it's not because they found so much error in their technique, it's because, well, it simply can't be. So this brings up the question then, well, how do you preserve biological material for over 65 million years in a fossil?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe you could go up to the board and
Yes.
show us, because I'm interested in figuring that out myself.
Well, there's a lot of proposed ideas, and again, they're virtually all just speculation.
So they're trying to find a way to make it work.
Exactly.
Okay.
The single most popular view for preserving the proteins is called the iron model. And it argues that iron will stabilize tissue. And it's going to argue that, see, blood's going to contain a lot of hemoglobin, and hemoglobin contains a lot of iron. And so the blood in the bone contains all this iron. The iron from the blood is going to preserve the tissue. That's kind of, in a nutshell, the iron model. Now, how's that work? Well, what's iron doing? Okay, very simply, it's called Fenton chemistry, and you can look this up in your chemistry textbook and such and study a little bit more, but the basis of it is that the iron from the hemoglobin is going to catalyze a series of reactions. And the product of these reactions is going to be some ions. Remember, ions, those have either a positive or a negative charge, and they look for their opposite charge. So if you're a positive ion, you look for a negative ion. Okay? But also, you're going to produce what's called free radicals. And like this hydroxyl free radical is very reactive. A free radical doesn't care about charges. It doesn't care if you're a negative charge, positive charge, or no charge. Free radicals react with everything. So the idea is that the iron from the hemoglobin, through a series of reactions, produces this free radical. This free radical will cause a series of cross-links which will stabilize the protein. Okay, what does that mean? Very simply, here's a strand of protein. The circles are the amino acids in the protein, because proteins are strings of amino acids. Okay, the free radical reacts with a couple of the amino acids in this string, in this protein, and the reactions then will cause these two amino acids to actually bind together. This is called a cross-link. Picture the protein like a piece of string. The more you wad it up, the tighter it's wadded up, the more resistant it is to degradation. That's the theory.
Okay.
So the idea with the iron model is we get all this cross-linking, all this wadding up of the proteins, and by doing that then, they become very resistant to degradation. And so they can supposedly last and last and last millions and millions of years.
Now they're theorizing this, but are they finding this at all, these kinds of iron doing this?
Well, there was one study done in 2014 to try to verify the claims of the iron model. Okay? It was done using ostrich blood vessels. And what they did was they soaked the blood vessels in hemoglobin, because remember the hemoglobin contains the iron, and they soaked the blood vessels in water, and they compared the two. Well, let's see where we get better preservation, in the hemoglobin or in the water. And they did it for 2 years, and what they claimed to have found was after 3 days, they noticed significant decomposition of the blood vessels soaked in water, but they said the blood vessels soaked in hemoglobin after 2 years are still intact. So they concluded this is a 240-fold increase in stability, which then if you say you can get 1,000,000 years worth of preservation without the iron model, take that by 240, that's 240 million years, problem solved, tissues preserved, the proteins are preserved, we got it exactly. And that was, in very simple terms, the conclusions of the study. Now, this is the hemoglobin soaked, these are the water soaked. These are in black and white, but what's one of the things you immediately notice? See how much darker these are than these. These would be in color, these would be red, because the hemoglobin is red in the presence of oxygen. That's why your blood's red. Okay? These are not red because what color is water?
Clear.
Yeah. So what you have is the water soak kind of pulled all the color out of the tissues. So just immediately, just visually, you would say this is better preserved than this simply because this is a nice, deep, rich red color. If you go to a grocery store and they have brown meat and red meat, which do you buy?
You're going to buy the red.
Exactly,
sure.
and
Yes.
they know that too. The brown meat goes on sale. It's just as good, but they recognize you think that red meat represents better preservation. When you're looking at something, you tend to find what you're looking for. Okay, so some of the challenges, 2-year study is not trivial, but very hard to extrapolate to 70 million years, especially a 2-year study at a constant temperature. Like I say, it's not trivial, but if you're going to say this 2-year study shows us what could have happened over the course of 70 million years of a buried fossil, say that's extrapolating a little bit beyond what would be reasonable interpretation. All right, as I said, the study admitted an insufficient release of the iron from the cells. In other words, they just put red blood cells in there and they couldn't get release of the iron. They couldn't get release of the hemoglobin.
And they need the iron to make those links to preserve the protein.
So they had to mechanically disrupt the red blood cells to get the hemoglobin out so the iron could be released. So by their own study, they failed to show that this would naturally occur. We also have to bear in mind that most dinosaur remains are found widely scattered. You rarely find intact dinosaur fossils, intact dinosaur remains. That's why to find 70, 80, 85% of a particular dinosaur is very rare. That's why it's worth millions of dollars, because usually you'll find one bone here and one bone there and one bone way over there. What that also tells us then is the way that these dinosaurs were buried was their bodies were broken up and these bones were buried individually, so they weren't soaking in a big pool of blood.
They weren't in that ideal laboratory condition to maximize preservation.
With maximum amount of blood to give maximum amount of iron. And so that becomes a challenge, is was there really even enough iron from the blood to be able to actually get much preservation going on of the tissue? We have to bear in mind as well that water is a very harsh negative control. It's called a biological solvent. When they soaked the ostrich blood vessels in water, what they were doing is putting it in almost the worst possible condition, because that will actually accelerate degradation of tissue. Your body has a lot of water in it, but it's all in a form of a buffer. And so what they should have done at the bare minimum was they should have put the ostrich blood vessels into various types of buffers, not just into water. What they did was they maximized the difference. In other words, putting in water and putting into something else, we're going to get a maximum difference.
You get that 240 times, whereas realistically, it's not going to be as bad as this. It's not going to be as good as this.
Exactly. It could have been much closer if they would have used a different type of solution
realistic
than water. The results were, as I mentioned, strictly visual in interpretation. They just said it looks
darker, looks
better.
looks
right.
Yeah,
it looks more intact, or it looks more degraded, but they offered no protocol for how they were measuring levels of degradation.
And there could have been ways they could have, added something to those two samples to see.
There was ways they could have actually analytically measured. They could have said, okay, this was the wall, and now it's this size. So there were ways of analytically measuring. There are analytical chemistry techniques they could have employed, but they didn't do any of that. And to me, this is a huge problem. It was strictly just visual, and that's very subjective.
They found what they wanted, so why keep going, right?
Very subjective. Another challenge that's being offered, even in the secular literature, is blood doesn't have enough iron. You got to get iron from the outside, from the rocks. The problem is iron in rocks is extremely insoluble. And the best way to solubilize it is put it in very, very low pH. That means very acidic. Now, what happens if you stick your finger in hydrochloric acid?
It's not going to be good.
Exactly. You're not going to preserve tissue by putting it in acid. So they're in a conundrum because to get the iron in, they have to use an acid because it won't solubilize if it's not an acid, but the acid itself will degrade the tissue. So it's really a race. Can the iron preserve the tissue before the acid degrades the tissue? If the Fitton reactions, if the iron model was really preserving the proteins in the dinosaur tissue, we should see a chemical footprint. In other words, the free radicals react with any biological molecule. We should be able to detect that chemically. There are a number of amino acids that are extremely reactive. In fact, methionine is so reactive, you just put it in air and it just starts reacting. If they were all undergoing all these chemical reactions, all this Fitton cross-linking, we shouldn't be finding these amino acids in the dinosaur proteins, and yet we still are. So there's no chemical footprint that you would expect to find if it was preserved by all these reactions that they're proposing.
Well, let me ask you this, and just to compare it to something that maybe we all think about or would recognize. You know, I think everyone has seen stories of them finding mummies in Egypt, you know, in the pyramids, and they're encased and tried to, you know, the Egyptians tried to preserve them as best they could. Would you find any would you find any soft tissue or proteins in these mummified remains that we know are only 3,000 or 4,000 years old?
You will find small amounts, but that's what's interesting is you're going to find small amounts. They've worked and worked to preserve these, and everybody recognizes just a few thousand years old, and you're just finding small amounts. You're not finding massive amounts of tissue still remaining with these mummies. So if we only find small amounts in intentionally preserved mummies that are, you know, 4,000 years old, 5,000 years old, and yet we're also finding small amounts of tissue in fossils not intentionally preserved that are supposed to be 70 million years old. You see, there seems to be a huge break point. And obviously, we would argue that's because the age of the dinosaur fossil has been misdated.
Let's just hold that thought right there. We need to take a break. Stay with us. More on immortal proteins after this. Welcome back to Origins. We're talking to Dr. Kevin Anderson, who's been sharing about immortal proteins. Well, I have to ask you, Kevin, what everybody's probably thinking. We're finding this tissue, soft tissue, these proteins in dinosaur bones. Can we clone a dinosaur?
To clone a dinosaur, the first thing you have to do is you'd have to find DNA. Not only find DNA, you have to find all the DNA. So even if you find a little bit of DNA, that's not enough because you have to find all of it. Then the answer is no, we can't clone dinosaurs. But that does raise an intriguing question. Is there any DNA still remaining in this tissue? The answer is we don't know yet. But in the 1990s, there were two separate reports where they detected pieces of DNA, or they reported detecting pieces of DNA in dinosaur fossils, but both those studies were so heavily criticized, oh, it's just got to be contamination, it can't be real dinosaur DNA, that I really think that put a chilling effect on people looking for DNA because, let's face it, we don't like to be criticized, and in the scientific world, you don't want to be heavily criticized because people then start, you know, not paying attention to your work. So I'm reluctant to say there's DNA that's been found, but I recognize also that there's DNA that has been reported. It's just been very heavily criticized.
And was it criticized because they had some evidence to criticize it, or was it that they didn't like what it was saying?
Admittedly, when you're talking about finding little pieces of DNA, it is easy to claim contamination because if you're going to find little pieces of DNA, you have to have it very, very clean. You've got to account for all possible contamination, and that's not easy to do. And in the 1990s, maybe couldn't quite account for everything. In this day and age, we're getting better. Okay, but here is an interesting piece of information. In 2013, a report stated that they were able to stain dinosaur tissues with a stain called DAPI. And DAPI is a stain that will bind specifically to what's called the minor groove of double-stranded DNA. Okay, let me illustrate what that is. You have the major groove, which is this area, and then the minor groove, which is this area. And DAPI stains to that minor groove. Now, in order for there to be a minor groove, there has to be a major groove on both sides. So you have to have a piece of double-stranded DNA at least that big in order for there to be the minor groove for DAPI to stain with. Now, this paper did not say, we found DNA, but it is certainly a tantalizing bit of evidence that, in fact, it may well be dinosaur DNA, and because it was found in a very specific location in the dinosaur cells, that's not evidence, or in other words, that would suggest it's not contamination. It is dinosaur DNA. But we won't know for certain until enough DNA is extracted that we can actually sequence to demonstrate it's not contamination from something else. Double-stranded DNAs are already very heavy cross-linked. Remember, the cross-linking to preserve the proteins is you put a lot of cross-linking in. DNA would react the opposite. If you started cross-linking double-stranded DNA, you'd break all of the current cross-linking and form new cross-linking, so it would no longer be a double-stranded piece of DNA. So if you have the iron model active, preserving the protein, it would destabilize the DNA, so you would not be able to even detect double-stranded DNA. So if somebody actually comes and reports, here's the sequence of a piece of double-stranded DNA that we found from dinosaur tissue, it will refute the iron model, and it will be an enormous strong challenge to the idea that these fossils are millions of years old, because as tough as it is to preserve proteins, it's magnitudes tougher to preserve DNA. We were talking about little pieces of tissue still in Egyptian mummies. They've only recently begun to consistently isolate pieces of DNA because it's so hard, because there's so little DNA in these guys. So now you're going to argue there's still DNA in dinosaur fossils as well. So that's why I think they'll be very reluctant to report. I mean, as a scientist, you want to report.
Yeah, you would think if you could find DNA in a dinosaur bone, you would want to shout that from the housetops.
But you would also recognize you're going to come under incredibly heavy criticism.
They're going to say you're not a good scientist.
Well, they're going to say, oh, it's just contamination.
And you didn't know it, and so you're a bad scientist.
Because the evidence, the existence of DNA in dinosaur fossils is going to be almost impossible.
So it's going to be an ad hominem.
Right, almost impossible for them to be able to just hand wave away and say, well, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
Now, I want to finish with a statement from Jeffrey Bottas. He's an organic geochemist, and he, in a 2006 interview, so this dates back a while, in a 2006 interview, he said, I can't imagine tissue surviving millions of years in dinosaur, and here's the reason why. He said, even if the T-Rex would have died in a cooler, drier climate than Hell Creek. In other words, Hell Creek at the time of the fossilization, remember, was wet and warm.
And warm, you said, which is not good.
Right, which is not good. Environmental radiation would have degraded its body. Bones absorb uranium and thorium like crazy. You've got an internal dose that will wipe out biological molecules. If you're going to say this bone has been sitting in the ground for 70, 80, 100 million years, it's been exposed to radiation for so long, there'd be no biological material left.
And that's in a better climate than it actually was in, he's saying.
Yes, and my challenge is that there is no current preservation model. There's no current preservation wild idea that will account for preserving this tissue for tens of millions of years exposed to radiation. In fact, it's never even talked about because they have no clue how to explain it. And yet there it is, we know it's exposed to radiation, everybody admits it's exposed to radiation. You can take a Geiger counter and run it over dinosaur fossils and it lights it up because they've soaked up a lot of radiation. As he just said, bones will absorb radiation like crazy for tens of millions of years and still have pieces of protein, still have stretchable tissue, still have intact cells. See, it doesn't work. And if the fossils are misdated, that means the rocks are misdated, and the whole geologic timescale that evolution is based on comes crumbling down like a house of cards.
And we're not just talking about, 100 million to 50 million, we're talking about hundreds of millions of years to thousands of years.
Yes.
They don't want to go there.
No, they do not want to go there.
Well, Dr. Anderson, I want to thank you for being on the show. This was fascinating stuff.
Yes.
Scientists have been finding dozens of examples of proteins, soft tissue in fossilized dinosaur bones. Everything that we know about fossilization says that that should not be the case. That if that is the case, the bones have to be thousands of years old rather than tens of millions of years old. The evidence is pointing them in a clear direction, but they do not want to go there. And that's because if they do, they have to give up the theory of evolution, they have to give up millions of years, and they have to allow for the Bible's view of creation. It just shows us once again that we know what the Bible says is true, and the proof is all around you. I want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Origins, and we'll see you next time.
For a DVD of this series, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling. And write to Origins Program, number 1815, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania, 15148.
This presentation was made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.